At the height of its power in the 2nd century AD, the Roman Empire was the greatest civilization the world had ever seen, home to 120 million people. The Romans paved 50,000 miles of road, built aqueducts that carried fresh water to cities, and gave the world laws, architecture, and a language that the future would inherit without question. At the heart of this empire sat Rome, a city of 1 million people, the largest in the Western world. Everything it built was sustained by the finest professional army the ancient world had ever produced. For centuries, the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, had kept the barbarians beyond the rivers and beyond the walls. The legions held the line. The darkness stayed at bay. But the empire was showing signs of strain. The great conquests were over. Without conquest, the treasury emptied. Without pay, the legions filled with mercenaries who fought for money, not for Rome. And from the depths of Central Asia, the force that would break Rome was already riding. They were called the Huns. Nobody had ever seen anything like them. Small men on small horses, with composite bows that drove arrows through iron at 200 yards. They burned what they could not carry and killed what they could not enslave. They left behind ash and silence. The first civilization to break before the Huns was the Ostrogoths. Their king killed himself rather than surrender. The survivors fled westward, straight toward the Roman Empire. In 376 AD, the Visigoths arrived at the Danube and begged to cross. Their message to Emperor Valens was simple: "Let us in, give us land, and we will serve Rome." Valens let them cross. It was a decision that would ultimately cost him his empire and his life. What happened next made conflict inevitable. The food promised to the Goths never arrived. Roman officers lined their pockets at Gothic expense. Proud warriors were exploited and humiliated. The revolt, when it came, was inevitable. In 377 AD, the Goths rose. Fritigern led his people in open rebellion, and for a year they raided and burned across the Balkans while Roman forces failed to contain them. Valens assembled 30,000 men, the finest force in the empire, and marched to crush the rebellion. He was impatient, overconfident, and wrong about everything that was about to happen. On the 9th of August, 378 AD, Gothic cavalry caught the Roman army from both flanks while it was advancing. The infantry was packed so tightly, men could not lift their arms to fight. 2/3 of the Eastern Roman army was destroyed. Emperor Valens died on that field, his body never found. The Roman legion had met its match. The age of infantry supremacy was over. Adrianople sent shockwaves through the Roman world. For centuries, the legion had been invincible. After this day, that was no longer true, and every barbarian king who heard the news understood it. In 401 AD, a Visigoth king named Alaric invaded Italy. He had served in the Roman army, had fought for Rome, and had been denied the recognition he sought. He came to take what they would not give. After the murder of the last great Roman general who could stop him, Alaric arrived before the walls of Rome in 408 AD and simply waited. Hunger, he knew, would do what armies could not. On the night of the 24th of August, 410 AD, a gate opened from inside. The Visigoths poured into Rome. For 3 days they stripped the city of everything that could be carried. For the Roman world, it was as if the laws of nature had been suspended. The city that had conquered the world had itself been conquered. For the first time in 800 years, Alaric died of fever. Weeks later, his ambitions unfulfilled. He had wanted recognition from Rome, not its destruction. He received neither. His people buried him in a river, so no enemy would ever find his grave. While the Goths settled in southern France and Spain, another barbarian people were making an even more audacious move. The Vandal king Gazeric looked across the Strait of Gibraltar and decided to cross it. In 429 AD, Gazeric loaded 80,000 people onto ships his people had never built before and crossed into Africa. Within a decade, He had conquered Carthage and built the only barbarian naval empire in history. In 455 AD, Gaiseric sailed up the Tiber to Rome itself. Pope Leo I came to meet him and negotiated mercy for the people. For 2 weeks, the Vandals stripped the city of everything that remained. By the middle of the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was a fiction. Its emperors were puppets. Its provinces were occupied by peoples who paid lip service to Roman authority while ruling themselves as they pleased. In 476 AD, the barbarian general Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor and sent him into comfortable exile. Nobody declared great ending. The empire simply ceased to exist. Not with a battle, but with paperwork. Rome itself shrank from 1 million people to perhaps 50,000. The great buildings stood empty. The aqueducts still ran, maintained now by the church rather than the state. The lights went out, one by one. By 440 AD, the scattered Hunnic tribes had been forged into a single terrifying empire. The man who forged them was Attila, and he was unlike anyone who had come before him. Physically unimpressive, Attila dressed simply and ate from wooden plates, while the gold of a dozen conquered kingdoms filled his treasury. His intelligence, however, was ferocious, and his ambition absolute. He had spent years as a hostage at the Roman court, an experience that gave him an intimate understanding of how the empire worked, where its weaknesses lay, and how to exploit them. He spoke Latin. When Emperor Theodosius II failed to pay his annual tribute, Attila launched a devastating raid across the Balkans, destroyed a Roman army outside Constantinople, and forced the empire to pay, far more than before. Then came an unexpected pretext for war. Honoria, sister of the Western Emperor, sent Attila a message asking for his help against a forced engagement. She enclosed her ring as proof of authenticity. Attila chose to interpret the ring as a marriage proposal. He announced that he accepted, and that his dowry would be half the Western Roman Empire. No denial from the emperor would change his position. In spring 451 AD, Attila led an army of at least 100,000 warriors across the Rhine. City after city burned as his forces swept through Gaul, Metz, Reims, Troyes, Strasbourg, one after another. The one man who could stop him was Flavius Aetius, Rome's last great general. He had spent years as a hostage among the Huns himself, understood their tactics perfectly, and had spent his career playing barbarians against each other. Aetius's key move was persuading the Visigoth king Theodoric to fight alongside Rome. His argument was direct. Attila, victorious in Gaul, would not stop at the Visigoth border. He would come for them next. Before the battle, Attila's shamans declared the omens dark. Disaster awaited the Hunnic army. But they offered one qualification. A great enemy commander would die that day. Attila chose to believe it meant Aetius. On the 20th of June, 451 AD, the two armies faced each other on the Catalaunian Plain near modern Châlons-en-Champagne. The terrain was almost perfectly flat. Almost. There was one ridge. Both sides raced for the ridge. The Visigoths under Theodoric reached it just ahead of Attila's Ostrogoth allies. A ferocious fight broke out on the slope, and in the chaos, Theodoric was killed. Theodoric went down under the hooves of the battle and was killed. The shamans had been right. A great enemy commander had died. But it was not Aetius, and his death only made his son more dangerous. Theodoric's son Thorismund seized his father's banner and drove the Visigoths forward, with a rage that shattered the Ostrogoth line. The ridge was secured. The battle had turned. Meanwhile, Aetius struck the exposed Hunnic flanks with his Roman cavalry. Attila's forces, fighting on multiple fronts, were driven back to their great circle of wagons as darkness fell. Inside the wagon circle that night, Attila ordered a pyre built from saddles and war gear. If the enemy broke through in the morning, he would burn himself rather than be taken alive. The next morning, Aetius made the most controversial decision of his career. He let Attila go. He persuaded Thorismund that his brothers were already moving against the Visigoth throne and sent him home. Aetius understood that a destroyed Attila would be replaced by an unchecked Gothic coalition that would threaten the Western Empire next. Better to leave the Huns weakened but alive as a counterweight. Attila invaded Italy the following year, burning the Po Valley. But he died in 453 AD, reportedly from a nosebleed on his wedding night. His empire dissolved within a generation. The Great Wave had broken. Aetius did not long survive his greatest triumph. In 454 AD, Emperor Valentinian III stabbed him to death in the throne room. A senator told the emperor afterward, "You have cut off your right hand with your left." While the Western Empire collapsed and Attila terrorized Europe, the most transformative event of the entire era was taking place in a city most Romans had barely heard of, Mecca, in the heart of Arabia. Around the year 570 AD, a child was born in Mecca who would change the course of history more profoundly than any barbarian king or Roman emperor. He was an orphan, raised by his uncle, trained as a merchant. Muhammad proved himself an exceptional merchant, honest, reliable, and deeply thoughtful in a world where those qualities were rare. A wealthy widow named Khadija hired him, then married him. They were devoted to each other for the rest of her life. But Muhammad was not only a merchant. He was a man of profound spiritual sensitivity, drawn from an early age to questions the polytheistic religion of his society could not answer. He retreated to the mountains to pray. In 610 AD, in a cave on the Mountain of Light outside Mecca, Muhammad received the first of the revelations that would transform the world. The experience was overwhelming, a presence of absolute power commanding him to recite words he had not chosen. He fled back to Khadija trembling. She held him and believed him. She was the first Muslim. Muhammad began preaching publicly around 613 AD. A small group gathered: his wife, his cousin Ali, his friend Abu Bakr, a freed slave named Bilal. The leading families of Mecca immediately moved to destroy him. The merchant families of Mecca saw Islam as a threat to the pilgrimage economy that made them rich. The early Muslims were boycotted, beaten, and driven to the edge of the city. Several were killed. In 622 AD, facing threats against his life, Muhammad and his followers fled to the city of Medina, an event known as the Hijra, the migration, which marks year one of the Islamic calendar. In Medina, Muhammad became simultaneously prophet, statesman, and military commander. He negotiated alliances between warring tribes, wrote a constitution for the community, and organized its defense. 8 years later, Muhammad returned to Mecca at the head of 10,000 men. The city that had driven him out opened its gates without resistance. He entered peacefully, destroyed the idols in the Kaaba, and declared Mecca the holy center of Islam. In 632 AD, Muhammad died of fever in Medina at approximately 62 years of age. He had begun with a handful of frightened followers and died as the unquestioned leader of most of Arabia. The force he had set in motion was only beginning. Within a year of Muhammad's death, his followers were fighting beyond Arabia. The great general Khalid ibn al-Walid, called the Sword of God, had never lost a battle. He would not begin now. At the Battle of Yarmouk in 636 AD, a Byzantine army twice the size of the Muslim force was destroyed in 6 days. Syria was lost to Constantinople forever. The Eastern Empire had met its match. The exhausted Emperor Heraclius, who had spent decades defeating Persia only to watch his victories swept away, wept as he left Syria. He said farewell to a land he would never see again. The Sassanid Persian Empire, Rome's great rival for centuries, fell even faster. Its main army was shattered at Al-Qadisiyah in 637 AD. By 651, the last Sassanid emperor had been murdered by his own subjects. Persia was gone, Jerusalem surrendered in 638 AD. The Caliph Umar entered on foot as a sign of respect and refused to pray inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, so that his followers would not later convert it into a mosque. It was an act of statesmanship without precedent in the history of conquest. By 650 AD, the Mediterranean world had been transformed beyond recognition. Egypt, Syria, Persia, Palestine, all Islamic. The sea that Rome had called our sea was no longer any one power's sea. The advance continued westward across North Africa, where it encountered its most formidable resistance. The Berber queen, known as Kahina, held the Islamic armies at bay for nearly a decade through military genius and intimate knowledge of the desert. She fell in battle around 702 AD. With her death, the last organized resistance in North Africa collapsed. The path to the Atlantic, and beyond it to Europe, stood open. In the spring of 711 AD, the Berber general Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed the narrow strait separating Africa from Europe. He landed at the foot of a great rock that would bear his name forever, Jabal al-Tariq, Gibraltar. At the Battle of Guadalete, the Visigoth kingdom of Spain was destroyed. King Roderick was killed, his army shattered. Within 7 years, the entire Iberian Peninsula was under Islamic control. The Visigoths, who had once sacked Rome, disappeared as a political force in less than a decade. Only a small group of survivors held out in the mountains of Asturias in the far northwest, where they would begin the 7-century-long Reconquista. The advance did not stop at the Pyrenees. In 718 AD, Islamic forces crossed into Frankish territory. The raids were devastating. The region of Aquitaine was ravaged. The advance continued north. By 732 AD, a major Islamic force under the governor Abd ar-Rahman was moving deep into central France. In 1 century, Islam had expanded from a single city in Arabia to the doorstep of Paris. Nothing had stopped them yet. The man who would stop the Islamic advance was Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer. Born illegitimate, imprisoned after his father's death, he had fought his way to sole power over the Frankish kingdoms by 719 AD. Charles spent 20 years in nearly continuous warfare, forging a military machine unlike anything in contemporary Europe. He pioneered the use of heavy cavalry and built a disciplined infantry that had never known defeat. When Duke Eudo of Aquitaine came to him in 732 AD begging for help against the Islamic advance, Charles saw opportunity. He assembled 30,000 Franks and Burgundians and marched south. Charles chose his ground with extraordinary care, a ridge flanked by forest on both sides, with the slope falling away before it. The forests prevented flanking. The slope would break the momentum of any cavalry charge. He had found the battlefield he needed. He positioned army in a solid rectangular formation, shields locked together, spears outward, flanks anchored to the trees on either side. Then he waited. Abd ar-Rahman studied the position for a week, probing for a weakness. There was none, but he had never lost a significant battle. He had every reason for confidence. He ordered the attack. On a cold October morning in 732 AD, the Islamic cavalry prayed before mounting. They had prayed before every battle. They had always won. They mounted their horses and charged. The thunder of tens of thousands of hooves crossing the cold field built from a rumble to a roar. The most formidable cavalry force in the world was going to war against a wall that would not move. An Islamic chronicler who survived described the Franks as standing like a wall of ice, immovable, their ranks absorbing the momentum of charge after charge without yielding a single foot of ground. Charles stood at the center of his formation and fought alongside his men. The Franks could see their commander in the line, not commanding from behind it, but in it. That made all the difference. The Islamic cavalry attacked again and again throughout the long October day. Each charge met the same result. a wall that refused to break, a discipline that refused to yield. Something the Islamic armies had never encountered before. Watching his cavalry fail, Abd-ar-Rahman made the decision that cost him his life. He led a personal charge into the fighting, driving deep to find and kill Charles Martel himself. He never reached him. Cut off from his bodyguard in the chaos, Abd-ar-Rahman was surrounded and killed. His death spread through the Islamic army like a cold wind, and the momentum that had driven them 1,000 miles in a century faltered. The charges became tentative, then stopped altogether. The army pulled back to its camp. Night fell over a battlefield that the Franks had held from the first charge to the last. The Franks stood fully armed through the darkness, listening. Charles held them in place, suspecting a trap, waiting for the light. He had not survived 20 years of warfare by being impatient. When Frankish scouts crept toward the Islamic camp at dawn, they found silence. The tens of thousands of warriors who had been there the night before were gone. Marched back toward Spain, leaving everything behind. The high water mark of the Islamic advance into Western Europe had been reached and passed. They never came back. The battle that may have saved European civilization from becoming part of the Islamic world was over. Charles Martel died in 741 AD. He never called himself king. He didn't need to. His grandson, Charlemagne, would be crowned the first Holy Roman Emperor in 800 AD, the direct heir of the hammer that held at Poitiers. From the ruins of Rome and the ashes of the Migration Age, something new was being built. Charlemagne's empire covered more territory than any Western European state since the fall of Rome. The medieval world was being born. In monasteries from Ireland to Italy, monks copied the texts of the ancient world. Virgil, Cicero, Augustine, Jerome creating the bridges across which classical learning would travel to the Renaissance. The barbarians had become the custodians of civilization. Behind the Pyrenees, the Islamic civilization that had been stopped at Poitiers was building one of the most sophisticated cultures in the medieval world. Its scholars preserved Aristotle, extended mathematics, and advanced medicine, while Europe struggled to maintain basic literacy. The Library of Córdoba contained 400,000 volumes at a time when the largest library in Christian Europe held a few hundred. European scholars eventually traveled to Islamic Spain specifically to access this learning, and carried it back north. In Toledo and Córdoba, Christian and Muslim scholars worked together, translating Greek texts from Arabic back into Latin, transmitting the learning of antiquity back to the Europe that had lost it. The civilization that had been stopped at Poitiers was also saving Europe's intellectual heritage. Constantinople still stood. The Eastern Roman Empire had survived while its Western twin collapsed, and would continue to survive for nearly 1,000 more years. It preserved the Greek tradition, transmitted it to the Islamic world, and eventually back to the West. By 800 AD, three great civilizations had emerged from the chaos of the Migration Age. Byzantine Christianity in the east, Islam across the south, Latin Christianity in the northwest. All three claimed Rome's legacy. All three were right. The Rome that the barbarians destroyed was not entirely lost. It was transformed, absorbed, and partially preserved. Roman buildings provided the stone for medieval churches. Roman roads guided medieval pilgrims. Roman law governed medieval courts. The Latin language survived in the speech of every Romance-speaking people. French, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, Romanian. All of them are Rome, spoken by descendants of the peoples who destroyed Rome. Three great buildings, three civilizations. All of them built on the same foundation, the ancient Mediterranean world that Alaric and Attila and the armies of Islam had shattered and transformed. All of them more alive than the world that preceded them. Valens. His decision to admit the Goths in 376 AD set in motion the chain of events that would end the Western Empire. He died at Adrianople. His body was never found. Alaric. He wanted a permanent home for his people and an official Roman title. He received neither. He sacked Rome instead and died of fever weeks later, the most famous barbarian in history. Gaiseric. He reigned for nearly 50 years, built a fleet from scratch, and twice put Rome in his shadow. One of the most effective and underrated rulers of the entire migration age. Attila, the Scourge of God. He united the Huns into history's most terrifying military machine and came within an afternoon's battle of conquering Europe. He died of a nosebleed. Flavius Aetius. The last of the Romans. He stopped Attila at the Catalaunian Plains and was murdered by the emperor he had saved. Military genius rarely receives the gratitude it deserves. Muhammad. Born an orphan in a desert trading town, founder of a religion that now numbers 2 billion followers, the most consequential individual in the history of the first millennium. Khalid ibn al-Walid, the Sword of God. He never lost a battle in his entire military career. He conquered more territory in less time than any general before him. Kahina. The Berber prophetess and warrior queen. She held the Islamic advance at bay for nearly a decade through military genius. History has not given her the recognition she deserves. Charles Martel. The Hammer. He stopped the Islamic advance at Poitiers, pioneered the feudal system as a byproduct of paying for cavalry, and founded the line that produced Charlemagne. 4 centuries, from the moment the Huns first appeared north of the Black Sea, to the morning the Islamic army vanished from Poitiers. 4 centuries that destroyed one world and built another. The Rhine still flows, the river that marked Rome's northern wall, that the Vandals crossed in winter 406 AD, that Attila's army crossed in 451 AD. Geography does not change, only the peoples on its banks do. The Danube, where the Goths begged to cross in 376 AD, where the chain of events began that ended an empire, still flowing, still a border, still carrying the memory of what happened on its banks. The Strait of Gibraltar, 7 miles of water that Turek crossed in 711 AD. The rock at the entrance to the Mediterranean still bears his name. Geography remembers what history forgets. The battlefield near Poitiers looks today like any other gentle French countryside. There is no great monument. The battle that may have determined whether Europe would be Christian or Islamic is marked by almost nothing. The cave on Jabal al-Nur is still there, visited every year by millions of Muslims who climb the mountain to see the place where the first words of the Quran were revealed in 610 AD. Some places hold their history. Rome endures, not the empire which is dust, but the city still there, still beautiful, still the place where the ancient world and the modern world overlap in every street and every stone. The Mediterranean at midnight, the sea that Rome called its own, the sea the Vandals raided, that Islamic fleets crossed, that Byzantine galleys patrolled, the sea that connects all of it, past and present, ancient and modern. Every field in France and Italy and Spain contains the buried remnants of Roman civilization, the physical memory of a world that was destroyed and transformed, but never entirely lost. The university, the institution that organizes the transmission of knowledge, traces its origins to the medieval schools that preserved classical learning, which themselves descended from the Roman schools that had preceded them. The courthouse, the concept that disputes are resolved by law rather than by the will of the powerful. Rome invented this in its current form, and it survived the fall of the empire because it was too useful to abandon. The Alhambra, built by the Islamic civilization that was stopped at Poitiers. What was halted at that ridge in Gaul still flourished for 7 more centuries behind the Pyrenees, producing beauty that the world is still grateful for. In 1492, the same year Columbus sailed west, The last Islamic kingdom in Spain surrendered. The Reconquista was complete, 780 years after Tariq crossed the strait. The long reckoning was over. The world that sent Columbus west in 1492 was built step by step from the ruins of the Roman Empire. Frankish military culture, Islamic scholarship, the revived classical learning of the Renaissance. Every link in the chain matters. The stage where all of this happened is still there. The same sea, the same rivers, the same mountains. Different peoples, different nations, different faiths. All of them living on the ground where Alaric marched. Attila was stopped, Mohammed prayed, and Charles Martel held his ridge. 3 civilizations, all heirs to Rome, all building something new from the fragments of the old world. The Mediterranean, transformed but continuous. The ancient inheritance, carried forward by peoples who had destroyed it. The Roman roads still run beneath the highways of modern Europe. The Roman laws still govern the courts. The Latin language still lives in the Romance tongues. Nothing built well is entirely lost. History does not end, it transforms. The great forces that seem at any given moment to be ending civilization are also, always, creating something new. The barbarians who destroyed Rome also became Rome. The lights of Rome went out. New lights were lit. Islamic, Frankish, Byzantine, Celtic. Each burning with its own color and heat, they burned. And from them, slowly, came everything that followed. History does not end. It transforms. And somewhere on the road that history built, the road that runs from ancient Rome through the barbarian migrations, through the rise of Islam, through the Battle of Poitiers, we are still walking. The road goes on. This has been the story of 4 centuries that destroyed one world and created another. The fall of Rome, the rise of Islam, the world between worlds, the world that made our world.